All right, so it's 7:02. I see our participants list is growing by the minute. Why don't we give just one more minute to make sure everybody can get on in time. And for folks that are joining, if you have questions and you weren't able to submit them earlier as part of your registration, there should be a button that you can click that says Q&A, and you can type your questions there, and then we'll make sure to get to them in the second half of our presentation. Okay, well, we're at 50 people. I expect that's going to grow, but why don't we go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. This is NIAC's first virtual briefing in these strange and unprecedented times. Tonight's event is NIAC in conversation with Congressman Tom Malinowski. We're going to talk about COVID and U.S. foreign policy. And it's great to be connected with everybody, even if remotely. I hope that this is an event that will be a reminder for the community that we're all part of the community. And even if we're isolated or socially distancing, we are part of a community of Iranian Americans and peace advocates and political activists. So just to start out with, I think it's important to say that in spite of recent events and the quarantining, the social distancing, we at NIAC, like probably all of you, have been really busy with our regular day jobs. And for us, it's been working on initiatives like restricting the president's authority to start a war with Iran, working to suspend sanctions during the pandemic, and then addressing challenges here at home, such as ICE detentions. A case that you may have heard of that we're working on is the detention of an innocent Iranian scientist with American children who was found guilty of no crime, was actually indicted of a series of bogus charges, and then was immediately swept up by ICE and is now behind bars, detained with no explanation and no timeline for when he's going to be freed. And he's sounding the alarm about the risk of him contracting coronavirus and his fellow detainees. So there's no shortage of issues for us to work on. It's also, I want to remind folks, it's census season. And so if you haven't already, please make sure to fill out your census form. It's available online. You can go to writeiniranian.org to get your link, but make sure that you're writing in Iranian. It doesn't matter if you're checking white or African American or other or whatever. As long as you write in Iranian, you will be counted, and we can make sure that the Iranian American community is counted as part of the census. So we have a lot to talk about. And I see somebody is on the Q&A, wants to know what my name is. I should have introduced myself. My name is Jamal Abdi. I'm the president of NIAC Action. And so tonight, we're going to talk about the impact of coronavirus on foreign policy. While at times this pandemic has made us feel isolated and socially distant, I think this is a crisis that also demonstrates how bound to one another we are. This is not a local or a national challenge. This is a global challenge, and we're part of a global community. And so no response or conversation about coronavirus will be complete if we're not talking about what the US role is in terms of foreign policy and how we as a globe are responding to this challenge. This morning, The Nation had a piece that came out that I think was of little surprise to many of us, but it revealed that military intelligence in a leaked briefing revealed that US sanctions are indeed having an impact on Iran's ability to respond to the crisis, and as a result is putting the region in danger and US troops in the region in danger. So we're seeing how this crisis is redounding back on our own service members and our own interests. So we're not divided from other countries. We're all in this fight together. So to discuss the foreign policy implications of the crisis, we have two amazing, distinguished guests. We have Sanam Anderlini, former NIAC board member, and we have Congressman Tom Malinowski. And Sanam and Tom will start a conversation in just a moment. A few housekeeping items. Many of you submitted questions before the event as part of your registration. We took a look through those. There were a lot of good questions. And so Sanam, as well as myself, we're going to make sure to try to get to as many of those as possible. If you have another question. If something pops up in the conversation, there is a box, a Q&A box. You hit that box, you type in your question, and then the second half of the conversation around 7:35 will be to answer your questions. So we'll get to as many of those as we can. Now, let me introduce our two special guests. Congressman Tom Malinowski is an immigrant himself. He's a human rights advocate, a former senior member of both the Clinton and Obama administrations. He previously served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And prior to that, actually when I first met him, he was an advocate at Human Rights Watch for over a decade. Following his time in the State Department under the Obama administration, he decided to run for Congress. And he was inspired in part by Donald Trump's abrogation of international agreements like the Iran nuclear deal, and his xenophobic and racist policies here at home against Americans and US persons, like the Muslim ban that remains in place today. And so while he did face tough odds, this is a district that he now represents that has not been represented by a Democrat since 1961, and he managed to change that trend. But he won his seat, and he now serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Middle East Subcommittee and the Investigations Subcommittee in that committee. He's been instrumental in a number of areas, including efforts to end the war in Yemen and cut off support for the Saudi bombing there. And just so everybody knows, he is going to face re-election in November, and this is a tough battle, and NIAC Action is very proud to endorse Congressman Malinowski for his re-election. And we hope that folks on the call at the end, we're going to talk about how you can help support and make sure that we re-elect this advocate for our interests in our communities to Congress in 2020. Hopefully 2021 will mark the new beginning where we can turn the tide on a lot of what we've experienced over the past 4 years. And then our second special guest leading the conversation is my friend Sanam Anderlini. Sanam is the director of the London School of Economics Center for Women, Peace, and Security. She is the founder and CEO of ICAN, which is the International Civil Society Action Network. They've done a lot of good work on issues like the impact of sanctions on women and civil society inside of Iran. Sanam is a renowned peace strategist. She has a long career of work with the UN, with governments, and organizing civil society. And most importantly, she's a NIAC member. She very recently was a member of our board, and she's somebody who cares very deeply about our community and our mission. So welcome everybody to the conversation, and Sanam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamal. I hope you can all hear me. Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and our community at this incredibly difficult and busy times. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump straight into the question and the discussions, and hope that we can have time for some of the questions that came from the audience. And my first thought, as we were thinking about the kind of the topic, is that when we think about U.S. foreign policy right now, in my work globally, working with women in conflict zones, especially Yemen, Syria, etc., one of the things that we're seeing is that the global ceasefire that the Secretary General Guterres initiated is really important to them. The call for the end of sanctions is something that really makes a difference to our partners in Syria and elsewhere. Even the UN statement on ending gender-based violence and domestic violence, which is a huge issue right now around the world with the COVID lockdowns that are happening, including in the US. All of these things, many countries have signed up to. I've been around long enough to know that signing up doesn't really mean anything very often. It's just, it can be window dressing. But the US hasn't signed up to any of these things. And it's kind of, I'm just wondering on a personal level, how does it feel to think that we are a member of the, one of the P5 of the Security Council? The Security Council is there to basically prevent wars and end wars. And we haven't signed up to the idea of a global ceasefire in the middle of a pandemic. How does that kind of, what does that mean? What's the signal to the rest of the world in terms of where the US is right now and what our leadership means? So I'm going to just start with that very simple question for you and your thoughts, generally speaking, on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to just thank you guys for having me and for organizing this conversation with the community. It's a great opportunity for me. As Jamal mentioned, I was inspired to run by a lot of things, many of them local to my state of New Jersey, but absolutely this administration's complete disregard for what I think are core American values was central to my decision-making process. I think the Muslim ban probably, as much as anything else in the early days, pushed me over the edge to do something crazy, i.e. run for Congress. And here we are, almost 3 years later, and that struggle to define who we are as a country and what we stand for in the world continues. And I think it's one that decent people are going to win this November, and hopefully we come out of it with a greater and wider understanding among the American people of what our country is and believes in and stands for. And if so, we'll maybe come out of this even stronger somehow for the character building experience that it has been. But we still have a lot of work to do. In terms of our international leadership, first I'll be very, very honest with you. I mean, I've spent my whole career working on foreign policy. I've not spent much of the last 3 months working on foreign policy. My first obligation is to the people I represent in New Jersey. We've been hit really hard by the COVID epidemic. I find myself spending time trying to help small business owners get assistance at a time when our economy is shutting down, trying to get equipment for our first responders and our hospitals so that we can help people, treat people, test people for COVID-19. Because if we don't do that, we're not coming out of this crisis. And there's no sense in talking about America's leadership role. We have to start at home by setting a good example, by showing that our government still works, that we can still be that shining model, not just of freedom, but of effective governance. So that's been my preoccupation, and it's the preoccupation of Congress and just about everybody else. That said, it is painful to see that, well, this is probably the first global crisis in my lifetime in which the United States is not leading, and in fact, increasingly not expected to lead by our partners because of their experience with the Trump administration over the last 3 years. And that is deeply painful to me because I'm a big believer in American leadership. That this crisis poses a huge, huge challenge to the people of the world, and there's nobody else other than the United States that can step up. Our European allies, many of them are well-meaning, but they don't have the resources or the tradition to lead. Certainly Russia and China are not going to do it except in pursuit of their selfish interests. The United Nations is only as good and as strong as its permanent members allow it to be. And so there is this vacuum. And meanwhile, an epidemic that is spreading around the world and that is going to cause tremendous damage in a lot of countries, particularly to people who are most vulnerable. You mentioned the global ceasefire. That's an effort to turn crisis into opportunity. And whether we sign on to that, I don't know, back in my State Department National Security Council days, I would have skeptically read it, and I would have had exactly the kinds of questions that any responsible U.S. national security official would ask, like what does this actually mean? Because America, unlike most countries, when we sign up to things, we mean them. We don't just sign up to things because they sound good. We ask legally, what does this mean for us? Would it constrain us from fulfilling real responsibilities for peace and security or self-defense around the world? But I would certainly embrace the spirit of it, and particularly looking at active conflicts like the ones in Yemen, in Syria, and elsewhere, particularly those like in Yemen, where we have particular influence over a party or parties to the conflict. as we do with regard to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's where I would be focusing my efforts right now if I had the power to do so.
Thank you. And that's exactly, I think, the challenge that the U.S. has such, as you well know, the U.S. is such a big player in enabling the Yemen war, which was completely, I mean, I don't think any war is necessary in the last few years, but this one in particular was such a, it was a strange war to get involved in. And it has been devastating. I talk to my Yemeni colleagues, and, you know, when we talk about washing our hands with soap and water here, my Yemeni colleagues are saying to me, what do we do when there's neither soap nor water? That's the level of devastation that we're facing over there. And it's sort of, it's this question of saying we're dealing with a crisis that if we don't, as you say, there's a local dimension to it, and we need to make sure that at home everybody's okay. But unless we are also recognizing that we need to work with the rest of the world, especially the poorest countries, the problem is not going to go away. It's going to keep perpetuating itself. So the vacuum is even more glaring than it has been in the last few years. On the question of, and this is something that is coming up very strongly in all of the questions that we've had from our colleagues and from partners in the NIAC membership. On the question of sanctions, you know, sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Syria, what we always hear is that sanctions end up strengthening the worst elements in those regimes. This was happening before the COVID crisis. It's happening now. What would you say about what the U.S. should be doing to alleviate sanctions, and especially given the fact that in principle, the humanitarian side, the medical and the food relief should not be sanctioned. That's not part of the sanctions program. It's just that the financial infrastructure and the banks are too scared to actually enable Iran to buy the resources and the supplies that it needs. So what do you think, what's your message to the Iranian American community and Iranians in Iran about what the US could be doing, what Congress should be doing right now,
Sure.
if you were in charge?
Well, let me start out by saying I have a reputation, or at least I try to maintain a reputation of being very honest with people about my beliefs, even if that means it might create a disagreement. I'm not a general opponent of sanctions. I am a strong and passionate supporter of sanctions against the Assad regime, which I view as genocidal. And we can go back to that and talk about it if you like. With regard to Iran, I would very, very much agree with you that in this moment, when we are dealing with a country that has itself been devastated by this epidemic, we have both a moral obligation and I would say a strategic opportunity to ease up on the sanctions that have been imposed, many of which were imposed after what I think was a horribly mistaken decision by the Trump administration to, excuse me, to abrogate the nuclear deal. And as you mentioned correctly, the exceptions for food and medicine are not effective, partly because there are some things that still need to be licensed, including ventilators, vaccines, other, they're critical items related to fighting this epidemic that do require a license. And on top of that, banks are understandably reluctant to get involved with any dealings involving Iran because of the complexity and the risk that they would face. And so what I would do is, number one, I would look at those items that I mentioned. None of them should require a license. And more broadly, I would impose at least temporary moratorium on some of the sectoral sanctions that are effectively signaling to banks that they can't be involved even in things that the U.S. government says are not covered by the sanctions. I think that would be a reasonable approach. And as I mentioned, I think it would be a strategic opportunity because ultimately our contest with the Iranian regime only gets won if if we have the hearts and minds of the Iranian people on our side, because only they can bring about the change that is necessary. I think this is a great opportunity for the United States to align itself with the Iranian people, who are themselves victims of their government. And if we do that, I would couple it with a very strong call on Iran to release prisoners, both for health-related reasons and also, of course, categorically to release anybody imprisoned for peaceful political activity. If we could do that now, but it will have no impact given our overall policy towards Iran. But with the kind of relief that I mentioned, it would put the Iranian regime, I think, on the defensive with regard to human rights as well.
Thank you. I think I would certainly on the sanctions vis-a-vis Iran. I agree with you. Again, if we have time to talk about Syria, we can talk about it, because I also deal with peace activists there, and they're saying that the sanctions really affect ordinary people far more than the regime. And it's not to say that we support the regime in any way. It's just that how sanctions end up playing out in these countries. But in terms of coming back to the Iranian question, I was talking to a colleague of mine in Iran and saying, what is it that we want? What do they want from the US? What are the chances? And he basically said that at this point, it doesn't matter whether we have a Democratic or a Republican administration in power. We've reached a point where the possibility of dialogue from their side is actually very, very low because of what's happened with the JCPOA and so forth. So in a way, it's actions. It's time for actions as opposed to words. And what I'm wondering in terms of, again, I have my views on this, but I'm just wondering from where you're sitting, when you think about the way in which this administration has played the game and come out of the JCPOA, has been putting this maximum pressure policy in place, what's their end game? And what is it that they want? What do they think success looks like? And what are the real risks of actually going down that path of what they want?
I can try to answer that question, but I don't want to suggest to you that there's a coherent answer to the question of what the Trump administration wants. There's one of my favorite philosophers, Isaiah Berlin, wrote an essay about the fable of the hedgehog and the fox. The hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many things. And this administration basically is the ultimate hedgehog. They know one thing. They want to sanction Iran and increase pressure towards ends they have a very hard time explaining. And I think there's a big distinction between where, say, a Mike Pompeo would be, where John Bolton was when he was National Security Advisor, and where Donald Trump is on any given day of the week, because Trump is all over the place. Sometimes he seems to genuinely want to have the kind of process with Iran that he has with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Sometimes I worry that he will veer from the extreme of what I think is a cruel and ineffective maximum pressure campaign to falling in love with the supreme leader, which I wouldn't want either. But if you look at sort of the Bolton-Pompeo crew, I think, although they don't say it, what they want is to force regime change. And what they believe in a very simplistic way is that maximum pressure will lead to that goal. That's the only interpretation I can offer, because if you look at the demands that they have made to the Iranian government, they're not demands that any reasonable person believes this regime could meet without, in effect, accepting sort of a self-regime change. And so the only conclusion I can draw is that somehow they believe this is going to lead to the collapse of the regime. And there's nothing in our historical experience which suggests that that is going to happen as a result of this policy. And again, I say that as someone who, as I just mentioned, I can support sanctions under many circumstances, but the idea that you can starve an authoritarian regime into collapse, it's just belied by all of our experience, even in cases where sanctions were effective in influencing authoritarian regimes to change. It just does not work in the way that they are trying to make this work. So, you know, some people worry about, well, what would, you know, would we be sorry if there was regime change? What would happen afterwards? I think that's an irrelevant question because it's not going to happen as a result of this policy. All that's going to happen is that I think hardliners in Iran are likely strengthened. The chances of reform movements from within the regime and without succeeding are weakened. And right now, in the middle of this epidemic, a lot of innocent people are going to suffer.
And yes, I completely agree with you. My own conjecture is that it's not just about regime change, it's actually about nation state collapse, that they want Iran to become kind of literally as a state and a society to be on its knees in the same way that Iraq is, in the same way that Libya is, and it's to the benefit of their allies in the region who seem to be bankrolling a lot of the think tanks and others that are here in Washington peddling their versions of regime change to us. But
I'm sure they really believe that either. You know, I think there's a careful what you wish for phenomenon underway with some of them as well, because they know that if such a thing were to happen, again, it's not going to happen, but if it were to happen, they would be left holding the bag. And they've seen the Trump administration is not really that reliable in a pinch. Yes, they will sell weapons. Yes, they will defend these regimes from their human rights critics. But, you know, Donald Trump does not want to get involved in a war to defend Saudi Arabia from Iran. And I think they've seen that. I think that maybe they were surprised to realize that, but that is absolutely the case. And so I think there's a little bit of buyer's remorse there as well.
Well, if the silver lining is that the region itself realizes that they need to get their act together for their own people, that would be certainly something positive to get out of this. But it's been hard to observe that, and certainly the voices here are very, very vocal around. You know, just yesterday again, there was, I think, another letter of people saying, you know, sanctions is working and so forth, which is just horrific. I mean, what I find extraordinary is you quoted Isaiah Berlin. I'll quote Sadi back to you, the Persian poet, that says that, you know, we're all part of the same human beings, we're all part of the same being, and when one part is hurting, if you don't care, we're basically not good human beings. And to think that at the moment, the people who are really most affected in Iran, as they are here, are health workers. And it's basically young nurses and women at home who are looking after people. We don't really know the numbers of the coronavirus deaths there, as similarly to many countries, but it's ironic that you know, we're putting all this pressure and not allowing them to buy their masks and their PPE, and you know, all this might and power is directed at incredibly vulnerable people. I mean, it's sort of the contradiction is horrific in terms of what it represents for the in terms of what the U.S. is seen as, I think, over there. One of the things that I'm wondering, again, coming from your human rights background and the work that over the years you've done, you know, we've spent 20 years in this country after 9/11 of beefing up a militarized response to the world. We went from a sort of a brief era of thinking about human security and engaging the world on a variety of different issues. And then after 9/11, it's been super militarized, very much kind of these forever wars. In the name of national security, all in the name of national security. And yet here we are at a state of incredible national insecurity because of this virus and because of our lack of preparedness and because of the sort of just the lack of resources that could have gone into sort of social protection measures. Do you think that there will be any appetite in Congress for revisiting the defense budgets moving forward in terms of both allocating some of those funds for national security in terms of human security, but also in terms of development assistance because the rest of the world is going to need our help, and others, that the poorer countries are going to need it. Do you see any appetite for thinking about national security and defense in this more humanized way, or are we or are the defense contractors already making sure that their share of the pie is not affected as we move forward?
Well, I would put it this way. I think you can answer that question without even thinking about the defense budget, because I don't think that's necessarily the problem. I think there is a reasonable chance, and I will do everything I can to advance it, that Congress and, of course, the next administration, should we elect a different administration, will make human security a far greater component of our national security strategy, and will invest the resources necessary to increase our currently very tiny investment in diplomacy and development and promotion of democracy around the world. You know, you mentioned post 9/11 increase in our defense budget. Absolutely. And, you know, we can debate the pros and cons of that, but it didn't stop the Bush administration from leading an extraordinary effort to attack AIDS in Africa with PEPFAR. Billions and billions of dollars, and the United States led the way. You know, one of the great ironies, I was not a great fan of the Bush administration's foreign policy in Iraq in particular, but Bush probably saved more lives in the developing world than any American president in history through PEPFAR, showing what America can do in the middle of a global health emergency. Barack Obama responded with tremendous wisdom and leadership to the Ebola emergency, not quite as expensive as the effort undertaken to fight AIDS, but a great example of what America can do with a generous heart and an eye to its own interest in helping others defeat these kinds of problems early on. And in the case of Ebola, before they come to the United States, that's the self-interest part. Yeah. So I believe we can do that. We're talking about investments that, even if we double or triple our current international affairs spending, would be relatively small in terms of our overall federal budget and easily affordable. On defense spending, you know, I may do a little counter programming here as well, because I do believe that setting aside, you know, stupid things like the Iraq War, over the last 40 or 50 years, one of the roles that America has played in the world is the maintenance of peace and security through deterrence and through alliances. Not war fighting in most cases, but the avoidance of war by being prepared and by maintaining alliances with countries that share our values, that are designed to prevent war. And that is expensive. And we are, you know, entering an era of great power competition in which real adversaries, not little ones like Iran, but real ones that could do serious damage, like Russia, an authoritarian Russia and an authoritarian China, pose a very serious threat to the international order that we set up after the Second World War. I'm willing to spend money to maintain military superiority over those adversaries for the sake of keeping the peace. But I also believe that we shortchange our interests and our ideals by failing to invest in all of the other elements of international leadership, such as the ones that you mentioned.
Can I just to maybe agree, but also add a point here that at the moment, again, this morning I was talking to my colleagues in Iraq and in Somalia and frankly in Indonesia and around the world. And what we're seeing is that like here, where we're seeing sort of the white supremacist movements kind of moving into in communities having brandishing their weapons, over there, these movements, including ISIS, are not only on the ground providing people with food and basic needs, because the government, our allies in many of these places, are not present, but there is such a mistrust in so many of these governments that people just don't believe them. And the extremist movements are spreading messages that, you know, don't believe in what the government is telling you. You can get together for your prayers, and providing food. And online, they're also recruiting. So as much as we have the challenge of Russia and China, or the big powers, the superpower type of contest that existed in the past, this other set of threats is very real, and they are really exploiting and using this opportunity to build out their support. And again, we are not there. We're not there as an international community. We're not there in terms of our, as we say, allies in the governments. And I don't think that this problem is going to go away very easily. So the question of, it's one thing to say we should put money into, you know, healthcare, but it's a whole other thing to say we should actually not be supporting wars. And so that's why I kind of come back to the defense side of the story, that what should be the pivotal shift, and how do we deal with this urgent issue of, is it ISIS resurging again in Iraq and places like that? So yeah, well, curious to see.
On the, it is what you described is exactly what happens. It's how ISIS initially moved in to Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria. It's how Boko Haram moved into northern Nigeria, and how many extremist movements, certainly Al-Shabaab. I'm more familiar with the situation in Kenya, how they moved in to a lot of communities there. And you're right, it is simplistic to say, well, we just invest more in diplomacy. I'd say it's also simplistic to say we shouldn't be supporting wars. You know, again, it's an easy thing to say. When you're on the ground in these countries, you realize that the challenge is far more complicated than any simple slogan can address. They face very deep governance challenges, human rights challenges, economic challenges, social and cultural challenges. The United States certainly cannot solve all of these problems for them, and even our best partners on the ground in many of these countries are deeply, deeply problematic. Sometimes there does need to be a security response. I've spent enough time with people who have been victimized by Al-Shabaab, ISIS, and you know, other extremist groups around the world to know that there are moments when, you know what, when they're moving in to kill you, there's got to be somebody who's willing to stop them from killing you, right? And we're not going to do that with professions of peace and love. But at the same time, if we're going to be doing that, if there is going to be a security response, it has to be coupled with using leverage with local governments and local authorities to deal with corruption, to deal with human rights abuses, and all of the other problems that when they exist, the extremists are able to exploit to convince people in their desperation that their only option is to turn to them for security.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that it's a combination, but the level of mistrust right now is so profound, and there's some serious things that we need to deal with on a structural level. Jamal, do we want to move to the questions from the audience and the participants?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you, Sanam. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. You too.
And Sanam, you're welcome to weigh in as well on these questions. So let me ask, I have a lot of questions about sanctions. Let me do a two-part question and try to consolidate as best as possible. So you mentioned that you do support sanctions, but not all sanctions, and you don't support the current situation. A lot of people are wondering, you know, has the experience with the Trump administration and the way that the power of the presidency has really been on full display, that Congress has not been able to, for instance, end the war in Yemen, despite passing legislation to do so, to cut off US support for the Saudi campaign there. Congress has passed a war powers bill to rein in the president's authority to start a war with Iran. And he's likely going to veto that and continue to at least perceive himself as being unrestrained. And then with sanctions, under the Obama administration, we did see every major sanctions bill that was proposed did manage to go forward, even when the administration opposed it, even when the administration said that it was interfering with their efforts for diplomacy. And we now see that the way that sanctions have been formulated are that they can be turned on, but it's very hard to turn them off. So for instance, with Trump abrogating the nuclear deal, he didn't have to pass any new legislation or do anything new. He just had to let those waivers lapse, and they automatically turn back on. So the question is, what is the learning experience from the Trump administration? Is there any thinking about how to reevaluate how we put these policies in place? And there's legislation by Ilhan Omar regarding sanctions to provide congressional oversight to actually require the president to justify the sanctions, justify why they should be kept on every 180 days, rather than having to justify why they should be relieved. Is there any has the Trump experience changed the perspective around Congress's role in these debates, and especially how Congress uses sanctions, and especially with Iran? Because, while I probably would say NIAC does not support sanctions, but not categorically. We do support human rights sanctions. We support sanctions if they are tied to a diplomatic goal. But we have seen how sanctions have been used pretty cynically to interfere with diplomacy. So what, if anything, has changed? If in 2021 we have a Democratic majority and a Democratic president, how is the thought process going to be changed because of the Trump years?
Yeah, look, what the structural issue here is that presidents are at the height of their power when it comes to foreign policy. It is very hard for Congress with, 535 members and so much diversity of opinion to be an effective player on foreign policy when an administration is determined to pursue a particular course of action. You mentioned a lot of the legislation that we've passed, actually, despite Republican control in the Senate, to try to moderate the administration's policies on Saudi Arabia, the war in Yemen, and potential use of force with respect to Iran. And, well, Trump can veto those provisions and resolutions, and we can only override his veto under the Constitution with 2/3 of the House and Senate, and that's just more than the politics will allow. We have enough Republican support to pass things, but not to get 2/3. So, we win symbolic victories. We show that the Congress is not with the program and that the president bears responsibility solely alone for these decisions, and that's helpful. But when you have a president who's absolutely determined to pursue a path like this, it's very hard under our system for Congress alone to restrain him. And especially when, in this case, the opposition party, the Democratic Party, controls only one of the two houses of Congress. It's remarkable we've been able to get a majority in the Senate for a couple of these things. But for the most part, truly restraining actions are impossible if we only have one of the two houses. Does it change if we have a new president? Well, yes, because we have a new president, right? If your question is, do we have structural change as a result of that, I would say no. I am a strong supporter of Congress playing a greater role in making decisions about war and peace. That's what the Constitution demands and requires. I've also gotten a little bit cynical through many years of experience in both the executive and legislative branch, in that I don't actually believe that most members of Congress who say what I just said actually mean it, that they actually want the responsibility of making these decisions. They want to demand the responsibility, but they don't really and truly want to exercise it, because then they would be responsible rather than just being able to blame a president for either action or inaction, depending on the circumstances. So, I think that the best answer I can offer you is, let's elect a good president to make good decisions, and let's elect more people to Congress who have the experience and the inclination to be leaders on foreign policy issues, so that they are actually willing to take the responsibility that comes with the constitutional role that Congress is supposed to play.
Yeah, I think that that puts the onus on the people on this conversation, organizations like ours, to build the kind of political pressure or space for whether it's Congress or the president to do the right thing.
Jamal, can I just there was in the list of questions and comments that we received, it was very interesting. There was a very kind of Iranian approach to dealing with some of these problems in terms of like there is a barrier. How do we get around it? And the suggestion from someone was, you know, if we claim that we care about the Iranian people and not the regime, why not allow a system of remittances so that people can send money directly to their families from here, directly there, you know, through some kind of banking, whether it's through the European system or others, but directly family to family. I'm just wondering, you know, it's things like these little things. The fact that we couldn't have people, I think, on Zoom and other platforms because of sanctions. Right. I'm just wondering, you know, these are such small gestures on our part, and yet they mean so much in terms of what you were saying about the hearts and mind side of the story. I'm just wondering whether there's any scope for doing that, any appetite for people taking a lead on that.
I would want to do all of those things, and you're absolutely right. Those are not small gestures. Those things mean a great deal to ordinary people. Yeah. Look, the ideal sanctions policy, it's never possible to do this perfectly, but the ideal policy is one that targets leadership, that targets those responsible for human rights abuses and corruption, but that also tries to empower people at the grassroots. We should be encouraging people-to-people exchanges and people-to-people ties. We should be encouraging family contact as much as possible. We should absolutely be encouraging money. If money is going to Iran, I'd so much rather it go through remittances so that a family in Iran can help a family in the United States can help their relatives in Iran set up a small business, right, with a little bit of extra money than top down, right? And yet we make it harder through this sort of hedgehog, simplistic, non-nuanced policy to do the very things that would enable Americans to align with ordinary Iranians for even some of the goals that, you know, the hardliners in the Trump administration say that they aspire to. So, you know, that's what I'd be doing. I think that's what a new administration would absolutely be doing. That's exactly where you would start. And frankly, a lot easier to do some of those things than just like a wholesale removal of the sectoral sanctions, right? So I think it would be great over the next few months as we prepare for hopefully a new administration in Washington to kind of come up with what are the smartest ways to encourage exactly that kind of subversive engagement, both humanitarian and potentially subversive.
And on the back of that, what is the chance or the willingness to think about this moment for some kind of prisoner exchange, especially for dual citizens? Mm-hmm. Most of us, it's deeply, deeply personal. I can't go visit my father's grave in Iran because I'm afraid of being arrested. So we have colleagues of ours who are in prison. And as Jamal said earlier on, there's an Iranian who is now in the sort of ICE system. What scope is there right now for some of those kinds of gestures to sort of lay the foundations, if you want, but also be, you know, urgently necessary for the humanitarian side of the story?
Yeah, again, I think that would be it would be a much more viable possibility if coupled with the kinds of humanitarian gestures that we've been discussing, and would certainly be viable at the beginning of a new administration, which both sides are kind of probing for opportunity. you know, I don't want to make any excuses for the Iranian regime. Those people should be released 100% full stop. But in the real world of the US-Iranian drama, it's hard to imagine the Iranian government right now simply seeing a self-interest in making that kind of gesture to the United States, given how little there is on the other side to be offered. That said, you know, with President Trump, you never know, because he swings wildly from one extreme to another at any given moment. He likes to see himself as a deal maker. If somebody were to tell him, look, you could get some number of Americans out of Iran and be a hero, and, you know, and you could do it by releasing a couple of people on our side, we might take it. I don't know. But I've quit trying to predict or promote those kinds of changes with this administration. I think we have to focus. We're now just a few months away, right? We got to focus on a peaceful democratic change in our government in the United States.
I'm not going to ask you about how likely it's going to be peaceful and democratic. That's a whole other question. Jamal, let's hope so. Yeah.
It's be terribly messy, but it will be.
Yeah, we hope. Jamal, any other questions?
Let me squeeze one more wonky foreign policy question in, and okay, we'll wrap up and maybe talk a little bit about that peaceful change in November. So I have some questions about China and how great power competition with China factors into US-Iranian relations. People are noting that the Chinese have stepped in to fill the gap when it comes to relief for Iran during the crisis, and that China has used US sanctions on Iran as part of a worldwide PR campaign to portray America as stubborn and unhelpful during this pandemic. So how should the competition with China factor into US-Iranian relations?
Well, Iran or no Iran, it is a real competition in the context of the coronavirus epidemic. A kindergartner would be able to win that competition because the Chinese government has put itself in such a vulnerable position. And this easiest of tasks is being completely messed up by the Trump administration. I mean, all over Africa right now, you've got absolute, this is a story that isn't making the headlines because nothing is in America apart from our crisis, but you have fury against the Chinese government because of racist attacks on Africans, people of African descent in China. In a couple of African countries, the governments, I do not approve of this, but the governments have actually detained Chinese nationals and said, we are not releasing Chinese nationals until you let our people back from China. That on top of the corruption that Chinese development projects generally bring, and indebtedness that they bring to the countries that receive them. That on top of the fact that the Chinese government lied about the spread of or the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan and withheld information from the World Health Organization. It would be so easy for the United States, if we were well led, to rally friends and allies and the hearts and minds of people in developing countries against the Chinese authoritarian model at this particular moment, and yet we're completely screwing it up. In part, I don't know how much the Iran argument works for them. Maybe it does, but I think, what's even more debilitating for us is that is defunding the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic. I couldn't think of anything stupider than that. Even if there's, legitimate criticism to be had of the WHO's leadership, just defunding the one effective global health organization we have in the middle of this is just a huge gift to every American, everybody who wants to attack the United States. And then the administration's diplomatic push to try to force countries to call the disease the Wuhan virus, which everybody sees as just an attempt to appease Trump's racism and attempts to blame the epidemic on foreigners and Chinese people. And like we're literally going to international gatherings and trying and refusing to sign global declarations unless our allies agree to call it a racist name. Like that's what's become of American leadership right now. And every time that happens, the Chinese walk away stronger because people are disgusted by our approach. And it pains me so much because I'm okay with taking it to the Chinese government. I cannot bear to see how stupidly and ineffectively they're doing it, and what it does to America's moral authority around the world at a time when we should be, when we should be at the height of our moral authority as the global leader in helping people survive this transcendent threat.
Well, we've got a big election coming up.
Yes,
I think that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure everybody knows there have been a number of questions about how folks can help make sure that we keep Congressman Malinowski in Congress, so that we have a strong foreign policy leader who knows what he's talking about and who can help drive things on Capitol Hill. So in the chat box, we do have a link for how you can support his reelection effort. And it's important that we show up. We have to show up, you guys. So please take a look at that. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. I think we could have probably taken a couple more hours of your time, but we really appreciate, especially with everything going on, you joining us tonight. Is there anything else that you want to let people know?
Well, again, I just want to thank you guys, and since you closed on the politics, this election is for everything. For those of us like me who are immigrants to America, this is about keeping this country, with all of its imperfections, this wonderful country, keeping it to the values and ideals that our families embraced when we came here. The reason why we chose America, that's on the ballot this year. And new Americans, whether we were born somewhere else ourselves, or our parents or grandparents were born somewhere else, new Americans like us, it really falls to us because in some ways we understand what this country has been and can be even more acutely than those who've been here for many, many generations. So we have to do this. And that means, of course, taking the White House, hopefully changing control of the US Senate, but don't forget the importance of keeping a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. Everything that we've done on Saudi Arabia and holding them accountable, and trying to limit support for the war in Yemen, on asserting congressional war powers responsibilities, on keeping human rights front and center in American foreign policy. That's all because we've had a Democratic majority in the House driving it. And if we can elect a different president, that president won't be able to do anything if he has a hostile House majority, as Barack Obama did for a good chunk of his time in the White House. You mentioned that. And that's going to be decided in a few districts like mine. I had a tough race in 2018, peaceful and democratic, but tough. And we're going to have another one in 2020. I've got probably the best funded, certainly the best funded and strongest challenger in New Jersey, and one of the best funded and strongest challengers in the country. And so I am going to need a lot of help, and I would be incredibly honored and grateful for support from this community.
We're going to do everything we can. Thank you so much, Congressman Malinowski. Thank you, Sanam. Everybody will be following up. Hopefully we'll have another event in the next couple of weeks. Let us know how this went. Let us know your thoughts, and go to that chat box, click on that link, and make sure to send your support so that we can have a new beginning in 2021. All right. Thank you, everybody. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.